All right, y'all. So now what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about African Americans in the Union Army. Before we jump into that, I do want to say that there were some African Americans who fought for the Confederate Army, but by a lot of accounts, from what I understand, is that a lot of times these African Americans were forced or felt forced to fight for the Confederate Army, and oftentimes were actually still slaves. And we're not going to go so much into their stories, but rather we're going to go into the stories of the men and women who chose to fight for the Union Army. And so, um, in the beginning, as I mentioned, like on the do not question, like as slaves are being freed, they are super grateful and joyful, and they want to join the army. They want to continue ending slavery. They've seen like the worst of slavery, and they don't want it to continue. But initially, a lot of these slaves are turned away. When we learned about the Emancipation Proclamation, we learned that a lot of Northern whites were actually pretty upset that the cause had shifted from keeping the Union together to now ending slavery because they did not see themselves as equal towards African Americans, or they did not see African Americans as a worthwhile cause. And that is going to cause a lot of conflict within the army. There are people who are going to want to leave because of that. And they don't want to add more fuel to the fire by letting African Americans join. But as the war continues, we saw that it was super bloody. What's happening is that a lot of people are dying, and the number of white people like volunteering to join the army starts dipping. And so, in order to keep the numbers up, um, what Abraham Lincoln and the leaders decided to do is that they let these African Americans join the war. And they, join the Union Army. They fight valiantly, and we're gonna see like they become some of the like most decorated soldiers in the war. But that doesn't mean that it was all good. Um, they face a lot of discrimination because like northern whites are not super accustomed to kind of sharing spaces with African Americans. They still don't view them as equal. So during trainings, they are discriminated against. In battles, they are not always allowed to fight with white people, so they have their own battalions. They're segregated, and they're kind of given a lot of times the worst jobs to do. And then lastly, when they are captured by the Confederate Army, they are treated 100 times worse. They are tortured, they are killed, they're lynched. And so this is going to kind of really set the tone for what life is going to be like for African Americans after the Civil War, right? It's just like, yes, they think that they're free, they think that they're equal, but they face a ton of discrimination because white people in America are not ready for that yet. All right, so right now we're going to watch a clip from a movie called Glory. This movie is a movie about a regiment of African American soldiers who are being led by a white officer. At the time, only white people were allowed to be military officers. But this is a really cool movie. This is actually a movie that I got to watch when I was in 8th grade and I was learning about the Civil War. And it pretty much just details the challenges, the successes, and everything that African American soldiers went through during the Civil War. And it does so in a pretty cool way. If you'd like to watch it, I think you can find a link on YouTube, or you can find the video on YouTube. Just make sure that you ask your parents for permission because there is some cursing in the movie.